Welcome to my channel. Please hit like, share, and subscribe. In this video, we'll be touching on the life and times of Eddie Kendricks. Eddie Kendricks was born on December 17, 1939, to Johnny and Lee Bell Kendricks in Union Springs, Alabama. He had one sister, Patricia, and three brothers, Charles, Robert, and Clarence. His family eventually moved to the Ainsley neighborhood of Birmingham. This is where he met and began singing with Paul Williams, who was also his best friend. They started singing in the late 1940s, and in 1955, Eddie, Paul, and friends Cal Osborne and Jerome Everett formed a doo-wop singing group called the Cavaliers. They began performing locally around Birmingham. Soon, the group decided to move for better opportunities in their musical careers, and in 1957, the group moved to Cleveland, Ohio on 123rd and Kinsman. They met manager Milton Jenkins in Cleveland, and then wound up relocating once more along with Jenkins to Detroit, Michigan, where the Cavaliers became the Primes. Under Jenkins' management, the Primes became popular in the Detroit area and eventually formed a female group, the Primettes, that consisted of Diana Ross, Mary Wilson, and Florence Ballard, later known as the Supremes. When Osborne moved to California in 1961, the Primes disbanded and Paul and Eddie joined forces with Al Bryant, Otis Williams, and Melvin Blue Franklin of Otis Williams and the Distance, after two members quit and became the Elgins, and then, on that same day, allegedly, became the Temptations and signed to Motown. Soon after, the Temptations began singing background for Mary Wells. After an initial dry period, the Temptations became the most successful male vocal group of the 60s. Although technically Kendricks was first tenor in the group's harmony, he often sang in a falsetto register. Kendricks sang lead for the Temptations on the following songs: Dream Come True, 1962, the group's first charting single, The Way You Do the Things You Do, 1964, the group's first top 20 song, I'll Be in Trouble, 1964, The Girl's Alright With Me, 1964, a popular B-side that Eddie co-wrote, Girl Why You Wanna Make Me Blue, 1964, Get Ready, 1966, Please Return Your Love to Me, 1968, and Just My Imagination, 1971. He was also chosen to sing a few leads in his lower registers, such as May I Have This Dance, 1962, and he shared vocal duty on other songs including You're My Everything, 1967, shared with David Ruffin, and a long string of Norma Whitfield produced psychedelic soul records where all five Temptations sang lead, such as the Grammy-winning Cloud 9, 1968, I Can't Get Next to You, 1969, and Ball of Confusion, 1970. He also led on I'm Gonna Make You Love Me, 1968, and Ball of Confusion, 1970, as well as Gonna Make You Love Me, 1968, a popular duet with Diana Ross and the Supremes, and on the Temptations version of the Christmas classic Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, 1968. During his time with the Temptations, Kendricks was responsible for creating most of the group's vocal arrangements and also served as wardrobe manager, including the now memorable purple suits the group wore for one performance. Though Norman Whitfield's main responsibility was the writing, Kendricks co-wrote and received credit for several Temptations songs, apart from The Girl's Alright With Me, Isn't She Pretty, 1961, and Don't Send Me Away, 1967. His favorite food was cornbread, and as a result, that was the nickname given to him by the fellow Temps. According to Otis Williams, Kendricks romantically pursued Diana Ross, lead singer of the Supremes, and he was said to have been close friends with Martha Reeves of the Vandellas. In her second book, Supreme Faith, Supreme singer Mary Wilson wrote that she and Kendricks were briefly lovers, but afterwards remained close friends. Eventually, Eddie became disgruntled. For Eddie, it all came back to money and Berry Gordy. Everyone would be in better shape, he argued, if Gordy's ways didn't force them to work hard and even jeopardize their health to make a few bucks. In 1991, shortly before Eddie passed away, he gave a rare interview to a Chicago TV station in which he didn't show an ounce of gratitude to Gordy and hinted that the calm Eddie Kendricks of the 60s and 70s camouflaged what went on behind the scenes. Looking back, it was obvious he had stored up decades of resentment, and with good reason, some may say. He insisted, "Berry Gordy is a man I do not know. I only met him about 3 times. I really don't know much about him. I just know he didn't particularly care for me. I'm just not a guy who will brown nose. I say what I think I should say, what I feel, what I think I can sleep with. I don't think I should be a yes man and agree with everything Berry says. And I didn't agree with a lot of things I saw, so we just never got to know each other." Implying that Gordy disdained blacks that were not of his pedigree, he added, "I'm from Alabama, he's from Michigan, and maybe I wasn't supposed to oppose him. I intended to speak my piece." He went on, "What did Berry Gordy do for the Temptations? He really didn't do a lot for us because we already knew where we were going," and revealed that as early as 1965, he began to consider quitting the group because of things he thought weren't quite right at Motown. "We were working with people who really didn't have our best interests at heart," he said. "We didn't get the support we deserved." Even so, he maintained that he actually didn't ever want to leave the Temps, but rather simply to record a solo album, a common practice within many groups, but it was not allowed. In the early 60s and mid-60s, Eddie and Paul were not as close as people thought. Eddie felt Paul had become too dictatorial because he was in charge of choreography. If anyone messed up on stage, which Eddie did a lot, he would get in their face, and Eddie didn't tolerate people telling him what to do. So eventually, they grew apart. Eddie grew closer to David. They always shared a room when they were on tour, and Paul always had his own room. However, during a scuffle while doing a show in Bermuda, David and Eddie had an argument. The argument escalated, and Eddie and David got into a fist fight. During the scuffle, they began wrestling with each other on the floor of their hotel room, and the crashing and screaming woke up Otis and Melvin in their room down the hall, sending them running in their underwear to break up the fight. Otis got there in time to see Eddie slap David upside the head, his glasses flying across the room. The brawl ended, but not without expensive furniture being overturned and holes being left in the walls of the hallway. Eddie was scared to death of his then-wife Pat Kendricks, who told people if she ever caught Eddie cheating, she would cut off his balls. Eddie had been bubbling over since David was thrown out of the group. He was almost becoming as big of a problem within the group as David had been. He had continued to confide in David, who would fill his head up about conspiracies and Motown, and Otis, which sunk in further, because whenever they got together, David would ply him with cocaine. For both, money or lack of it was the root of the Motown evil, in their belief that the group was being royally ripped off. David's grievances kept manipulating and pounding away over and over at Eddie that Gordy had robbed all of them and had no concern for them beyond using their voices to make money, and that their refusal to fall in line gathered animosity. His own departure from the group, he insisted, was just the beginning of a purge that would inevitably claim Eddie as well. "You're next, brother," he would tell him between snorting lines of coke. Otis, David said, was just an agent for Berry's vindictiveness, a traitor to the Temptations. Later, David began to notice the effect he had on Eddie. "Now it's getting to him," he said. "Now the MF is beginning to see. I told him. Others thought I was crazy, but they see it now too." Whether any of the others actually took David's advice is unclear, but Eddie surely did. By 1971, the bond that had kept Eddie with the Temps after David was let go had been eaten away. No longer was there a mutual understanding that whatever Eddie said or did to show his discontent with David's absence would not disturb his loyalty to them, a brazen assumption that caused Eddie to skip several gigs, the same offense that had gotten David fired. He even neglected to show up for a local TV dance party show one day, which forced the Temptations to perform as a foursome, with Otis lip-syncing Eddie's falsettos. Sheepishly, Eddie promised not to do it again, and it was no longer mentioned. But even that sort of forbearance didn't satisfy Eddie once he convinced himself that his word meant nothing within the group, and that Otis's role had grown from decision-maker to dictator. In the early 70s, Eddie decided to test how much stock Otis put into his opinions, if any. It was time, he said, to confront the money issue head on, to use the Temptations' standing to put a squeeze on Gordy. "Otis," he would say, "we should go on strike. No more touring, no more records, no nothing until Berry gives us a bigger slice of the pie." Such a request was unheard of at Motown, but Eddie had watched Stevie Wonder, who turned 21 in the same year his contract was due to be renegotiated, refuse to re-sign with Motown, and moved to New York as a free agent to make music with complete creative control, a sort of passive strike that would eventually compel Gordy to come crawling back with an offer of $13 million to keep him at Motown. For Otis, however, the issue was not merely one of money or even loyalty to Berry, but it was the culture of Motown, in which talent had to be constantly proved. "I knew what Eddie was saying," Otis had said. "We were all being shafted, that was true, but the fact was, Berry held his power over our heads. Unless you were Diana Ross or Stevie Wonder, you really had no power. We couldn't leave because he had us under contract, and if we did not record, we would just fall behind all of the other acts. Berry didn't care who sang the hits, just that someone could, and there were acts begging for a Norma Whitfield song. It would have been a self-destructive thing to do. No person was bigger than the Temptations, but no act was bigger than Motown. We got to do the opposite of the strike. We have to keep recording as much as we can. That was the only way we could get in a stronger financial position." Eddie wasn't convinced and demanded it be put to a vote, but as usual, Melvin fell in line behind Otis. Eddie had thought he could work on Dennis, telling him the lead singers of the Temptations had to stick together or else they would wind up like David Ruffin. But Dennis, who was so timid that Otis, even though Dennis always backed him up, couldn't stand it. "God damn it, speak up, take a stand on something," he raged out at him once. Anyway, Dennis followed the prevailing wind, effectively killing Eddie's plan. Paul also voted against Eddie, but was far more willing to cut Eddie some slack. Paul was torn, Otis had said, between Eddie and the group. When Eddie would get upset, Paul would say, "Otis, he didn't mean it. You know Eddie, he's a hothead. Leave him to me, I'll talk to him." He often did, and after the strike failed, doing so may have saved Eddie's job. Shortly after, licking his wounds, Eddie went to see Paul. He was burning hot. As Joe "Scoonie" Williams, Paul's younger brother, who was there, recalls, Eddie was stomping around saying, "I'm not going to hit another note with this group." Paul, who had heard Eddie say that several times, said, "Oh, Eddie, come on, man. Not again." Eddie had pulled out a list of all of their concerts. He said, "Look, we sold out Shea Stadium, and we didn't even get a dime. I'm sick of this SHIT." Eddie wanted to go see Berry. Paul couldn't stop him, so he went along with him. They all jumped in Eddie's car and drove to Berry's office on Woodward Avenue. Eddie jumped out, and Paul and Joe tried to keep up with him. He went past all the secretaries and walked in on Berry. That was something else. I couldn't believe someone was talking to Berry the way Eddie was. He was pointing his finger and cursing, and it seemed like he was going to jump behind the desk and grab him. But Paul kept saying, "Eddie, calm down, man," Eddie replied. "This Emma effer is ripping us off." Finally, Eddie blew up again saying, I ain't singing with this group no more. I'm done." After Eddie left Berry's office, Paul stayed behind to talk to Berry, and Berry told Paul to make things right with Eddie, that they had to straighten things out. Fortunately for Eddie, he did, and Gordy was remarkably tolerant regarding the incident, no doubt with the sales of the Temptations being a part of the equation. Still, Eddie would remain on a slow boil for the next several years. During that time, he would add another reason to add to his hatred of everything Motown: Paul's alarming deterioration and how the group was handling it, or more accurately, how Otis was handling it, which Eddie believed was meant to kick them both into the garbage bin. Eddie's sense of loyalty and solidarity to his childhood friend had by now overridden Paul's arrogance, the arrogance that had caused so much friction between them in the early and mid-60s. It genuinely hurt Eddie to see Paul reduced to a shadow of the man who had been straight as an arrow, with a strong and pitch-perfect voice and the coordination of a world-class athlete. Liquor had eroded all of that, and it took a horrible toll on Paul. What few knew at the time was that Paul had sickle cell anemia, the blood disorder present in around 1 in 5,000 African Americans. What's not clear is whether he had the trait or the disease, which cuts a male victim's life expectancy to 42 years. The trait, however, is survivable. Whichever it was, any symptoms of the condition, fatigue, fever, difficulty breathing, arthritic aches and pains, were latent until he turned 30. Not incidentally, that was after he had taken up with an attractive Motown hairstylist, Winnie Brown, who was a cousin of Florence Ballard, and thus had close relationships with two of Motown's alcoholic souls. Looking to move deeper into the Motown A-list, it apparently mattered little to her that Paul was still married. Scoonie Williams, Paul's brother, says that Paul and Mary, Paul's wife, had separated when Paul was seeing Winnie. He liked Winnie because she did not tolerate imperfection. Paul never wavered in his belief that he was meant to be a temptation. Whether or not he truly believed that, it was something he needed to believe, because without it, he felt he had nothing worth living for. The gathering twin hurricanes surrounding Eddie and Paul made landfall during a tumultuous 2-week engagement at the Copacabana in November 1970, which broke to pieces right from the start, when during the early shows, Otis received a call from Detroit with awful news. His mother, Hazel Williams, had gone into the hospital for some minor surgery over the weekend and died on the table. He had visited with her the day before going to New York. Other than asthma, she seemed fine, but in a jolting moment, she told him out of the blue, "When you get back home, I won't be here. You're never going to see me again." He told her she was talking crazy and left for New York, and now she was gone. Devastated, Otis fell into his wife Ann's arms crying. He made a quick trip home to bury the woman who changed his life by taking him from Texarkana to Detroit, then had gone back for the next show. But he was numb, distracted, and at one point his voice cracked during an important chorus harmony, drawing an angry stare from a less sympathetic Eddie, which many in the audience couldn't help but notice. Otis, who had just about had it with Eddie, saw that stare and was livid about it. But he was in no mood, as he said, to lock ass with Eddie, and he let it drop. But Eddie wouldn't. Looking for an excuse to have it out with Otis, he waited for him between the evening's two shows. When he found Otis and Melvin had slipped out the back door, he flipped out, leaving as well, and did not come back. Minutes before showtime, Foster told Otis, "It doesn't look like Eddie's going to make it." They then had to go on as a foursome and pray the crowd would accept it, which they did, sparing the public relations nightmare of the Copa issuing refunds at their expense and perhaps even being banned from the club. As Otis recalled, Eddie left and he never came back, and that was when it was decided, or we were forced into deciding, that Eddie would be leaving the group. We didn't try to stop him, and he didn't want to come back, so that was that. He also remembered that the night before, the two of them had briefly spoken. "Corn," he told him, "I've known you for 10 years, but I feel like I never knew you at all." "Otis," Eddie replied, "you never really did know me." Eddie wasn't gone just yet. With their current album in production and a January 31st Ed Sullivan Show appearance on tap, he consented to stay as an official Temptation until then. That would allow Otis and Melvin time to find a replacement, something they had to do without Paul's input. Sadly, the Copa would be Paul's last performance as well. Whitfield wasn't much interested in finding a proper send-off for Eddie or Paul in the studio, but by coincidence, the Temptations had been pestering him, saying they had enough already with the acid funk, and that they needed to get into the contemporary trend of gushy romantic soul, or back into it, since they had, after all, pioneered that. But recently it had been taken over by buttery singers like Tyrone Davis and Clarence Carter, and especially the velvety Philadelphia groups like the Delphonics, the Moments, and the Stylistics. Because Motown, even now, revolved around the writer, producers, and not the talent, Whitfield still made the call. He could have refused, but the man was nothing but smart about what made music sell, and what it all came down to was timing. No matter how good a song had to hit the public at the right time. And after the rise of mellowed out soul, it was time for some changes. Whitfield had kept his hand in a soft soul pot and needed only to reach back for a melody he had played around with a year before. He gave it to Barrett Strong to write some lyrics to it, one with a soft feel that Eddie could navigate with his signature cool, impassioned sex appeal. The song, Just My Imagination, was a clear throwback to the sound and flavor most people associated with the Temptations, but was lately thrown to the side. The pleas of a real man who showed it was cool to cry. Strong but vulnerable men, shedding tears over women they imagined as perfect, who could turn them inside out in anguished passion, and in this case, almost pitifully divert them into the shadows, able only to fantasize. Pitiful as the song was, it was believable. As Otis listened to Eddie putting an unforgettable period on his Temptations career, he now calls it Eddie's finest moment. He couldn't help but align the time of the song with the melancholy in the room and the end of something he never wanted to lose. "I believe that was on Eddie's mind when he did that vocal," says Otis. "It was like Paul at the Copa. Those were no ordinary performances. Those came from deep down, from their hearts and souls. Didn't matter that Eddie didn't even talk to us. I think he wanted to make it something special. He needed to. And he did. Even now, for me, it's hard for me to perform that song or just to listen to it because there's so many emotions it brings back. Not only about Eddie, but Paul. So for a lot of reasons, that's a tough one to get through, even today. And with that being said, I have to say that that movie really portrayed, and it was a short movie, considering that was a number of years that all of these things transpired with the Temptations. But they did a pretty good job of giving little hints here and there of how each of the Temps felt at a certain time. So they did a really good job with that movie. So moved was Otis by the job Eddie turned in, he stayed in the studio all night with Whitfield getting the lead vocals right, and then he called him the next day to tell him. I wanted to reach out to him, Otis says, but Eddie was unreachable. All that remained for him were the last goodbyes. A few weeks later, on January 14th, 1971, Just My Imagination was released. Profiting from a lot of exposure, it leaped onto the charts. Heard on radios everywhere, black stations, white stations, and everything in between. It bounded to number 1 pop and R&B by the first week of April, displacing Me and Bobby McGee and spending 2 weeks there before being knocked out by Joy to the World. In all, it would endure 12 weeks in the top 40, ingrained as a classic love ballad then and thereafter. By that spring, too, Motown had preferred Eddie a solo deal, having been in the same boat as David, unable to sell himself to another label for the right price because his Motown contract had another 3 years on it. He moved the remaining years onto a new 4-year contract with an agreement to issue his debut solo LP right away, without waiting for a hit single to propel it into the marketplace. This was the album he had wanted to record as a break from the Temptations. A privilege, Gordy had refused him, and all others within Motown groups until Michael Jackson won the okay for his first solo album in 1972. Though Eddie, like Ruffin, whined about being stuck on the Motown plantation, he, just like Ruffin, was blessed in having the great Frank Wilson to produce him. Wilson complemented Eddie's songs with those written by Wilson and Chicago songwriter Leonard Caston Jr., former frontman of the R&B group The Radiants and son of Delta blues pianist Leonard Baby Doo Caston. The result, the 7-track All By Myself, was released in April, a month after the official Motown announcement of his departure from the Temptations. Of course, a main priority for Wilson was to keep Eddie's songs in the ballpark of the Temptations' grooves, and they came out with the same smooth white glove soul, but with nifty turns, such as Eddie's proto-rap on Caston's This Used to Be the Home of Johnny May, a wistful journey back to lost youth. Not about Johnny May Matthews, though. The irony was inescapable. Motown wanted to position Eddie more in the Marvin Gaye niche of blended introspection and dance music. The cover of the album had him in full beard, a la Marvin, skinny as a rail, hungry to make a statement. But it would take time. The LP peaked at number 80 pop. Its 2 singles, So Hard for Me to Say Goodbye and Can I, going to number 88 and number 101, respectively. But on the R&B chart, Myself made it to an impressive number 6. The singles into the R&B top 40, all with very little promotion, serving notice that Eddie Kendricks was here to stay and he was in the game all by himself. Otis had said, Eddie didn't think I had Paul's interest in mind, but it wasn't my choice to pull him off the road. It was Paul's doctor. We'd finally convinced him to see one, and after he did, the doctor told Don Foster that Paul had to come off the road. No ifs, ands, or buts. He was just too sick. His respiratory system was shot. He had no lungs left, basically, and he may have had a spot on his liver. I mean, I never knew if I'd find him dead or if he'd drop dead on the stage. One time I went to his room to wake him up, I shook him, called his name, but he just laid there. For a minute I thought, uh-oh, he done gone and died. Then, like in slow motion, he began to move, but he could barely sit up. He said, Otis, you don't know how bad I feel. He felt even worse, though, when Otis told him he couldn't be a temptation. For Paul Williams, who probably only now knew how far gone he was, it was not unlike someone taking a gun, pointing it at his head, and pulling the trigger. Public remarks were soon made by Eddie, in which he claimed he left the Temptations because of Otis's and Melvin's jealousy, and gloated about the failure of It's Summer and the successful redirection of Smiling Faces Sometimes, which he took as proof that Whitfield had lost interest in the Temptations after producing records after Eddie left and they weren't successful. Ruffin, never one to avoid inflaming an already simmering situation, piped in with the oh by the way revelation that he and Eddie were thinking of luring Dennis Edwards away to join them in a new group, and that Paul Williams would also be involved when he got well. Those were fighting words to Otis, and when Whitfield began to cut Superstar, which was written about a producer friend of his, he demanded that it be conscripted and reworked to answer Eddie and David. Whitfield, who was also pissed off at Eddie's dragging him into the argument, although he likely did have less intensity for the Temptations now that Kendricks was gone, as would become evident, agreed. He and Strong came up with such barbs as for David, Superstar, good God, enjoy your champagne and caviar and your chauffeur-driven fancy car, but remember how you got where you are. And for Eddie, bright lights don't let the bright lights blind you. Bridges don't burn them behind you. While these songs were intended as irony, a send-up of the two ex-temps' pretensions that they were bigger than they were, Eddie and David enjoyed being branded as superstars, and yet the song, a fast-paced chunk of pop funk with loud horns and gritty piano and guitar licks, carried no such undercurrent for more casual Temptations fans who would have been surprised to know that anything had changed within the group. Such was Harris's dead-on imitation of Eddie. Far more important than any of the byplay was that the song, by rising to number 18 pop and number 8 R&B late in 1971, was a step back to prominence and a step ahead into another Temptations phase that would bring enduring popularity in spite of serious personal shifts. Though not part of the Temptations' ongoing journey, Paul Williams tried to hold on to the tenuous connection, even if only by his fingernails now. He would ring up Otis, Melvin, or Dennis and ask to be filled in on what was happening, but such vicarious gratification only made him feel less useful and more adamant that there was no good reason for his proscription, not even dire diagnosis from doctors or the recurring stays in hospitals. Neither did Eddie help his shattered frame of mind. In fact, he shamelessly exploited it. Rather than give Paul pep talks, Eddie, perhaps to ease his guilt that by exiting the group all he had left Paul was alone, badmouthed the Temptations, assuming the same advisory role that Ruffin had with him, and filling Paul's head with conspiracy theories such as that his enforced absence from the group was proof that Otis, with Melvin as his stooge, was trying to write Paul out of the group as payback for Eddie's sedition. Even if Paul bought any of that, what Eddie didn't seem to realize, or if he did, was that Paul needed the Temptations and needed to believe he would get back. Indeed, playing both sides, Eddie would sometimes call Otis and remind him not to forget about Paul. Otis, who knew what Eddie was telling Paul behind his back, thought it was the height of arrogance and hypocrisy, and that Eddie was trying to cover his own butt should the worst happen to Paul. It hurt then, and still, that Eddie would accuse him of turning his back on Paul. Look, he says, I was the one who insisted that Paul keep getting paid, to keep him on the payroll as a choreographer and a consultant, even though he really didn't do anything with us. What did Eddie do for him during that time? except badmouth us to him. See, it wasn't Eddie's responsibility. He was gone from the Temptations, and in his mind, that must have meant he didn't need to look after Paul. But that's what we had to do, and part of that was making sure he didn't go broke. Paul was kept on the payroll at his usual 1/5 share of royalties. Street and Harris were put on a salary of $400 per week with small percentages of royalties on the songs they sang on. And the priority to keep him solvent took on real urgency when the IRS came after him in the early 1970s for $80,000 in unpaid back taxes. Proof positive that Shelley Berger wasn't blowing smoke about how Motown artists who hired outside accountants, as Paul had in recent years, found fact that he could have left Motown in 1972 when his contract expired, but signed up for another 4 years. By contrast, Eddie was making meaningful contemporary music on his own. His second album, People Hold On, recorded a la Stevie Wonder, not with Motown musicians but with his own backup band from D.C., the Young Senators, was pitched as a concept album dedicated to Black America, dotted with African rhythms, gospel soul balladry, proto-raps, and social pontificating, such as on the Curtis Mayfield-like title track. But it was the funky dance grooves that made it fly. The 8-minute Girl You Need a Change of Mind, with Eddie cooing so winsomely that no woman could have objected to his avowal that, now I'm for women's rights, I just want equal nights, becoming all the rage in the New York discos. Indeed, some would anoint the record as the first disco song. And that's funny because I was one time with my girlfriend's mothers. We were all in the house. We were. It was someone's birthday or something, and we were playing that song. I put that on. I was playing music for them, and I put on Eddie Kendricks' "Girl, You Need a Change of Mind," and all of a sudden it turned into a party. They just started coming in the living room singing, and I'll never forget that. Eddie Kendricks was definitely a part of the soundtrack to my life. What made the flip-off more satisfying to him was that the LP, when released in May 1973, blew up the charts, going to number 18 pop and number 5 R&B, and mandating a single release for Trucking, slated for August. For Eddie, the timing was good, since the Temptations, faced with the impossible task of living up to Papa Was a Rolling Stone, came up short with their next album, Masterpiece, though Whitfield believed the title would certify his genius. Indeed, not a soul at Motown failed to hear it as a Whitfield oratorio. He not only wrote every song, but, again abetted by Paul Reiser, drove the group deeper into the background. The title track ran a numbing 13 minutes and 49 seconds, leaving room for only one other track on side 1, and just 6 in all. For 2 days, Paul's open casket was on view at Cole's funeral home, the mortuary next door to Motown, and an estimated 2,500 people filed past it. On August 24th, the funeral was held at the Tridestone Baptist Church, which was overflowing with mourners. Outside, the streets were lined with both fans and people who came to gawk at the celebrities, who of course included the Temptations, past and present, but not Berry Gordy, who chose not to make the trip. He hated traveling back to Detroit. When the casket was brought to the church, the pallbearers were Eddie, David, Dennis, Melvin, Otis, and Cornelius Grant. All were racked with grief, but David was all but inconsolable. Having asked to sing Paul's signature stage song, The Impossible Dream, he stood just feet from the open casket and began, but only could get halfway through it, his shoulders heaving as he sobbed, and when he nearly fell to his knees, the others rushed up, with Eddie grabbing him under the arms and raising him back up, and all of them, hand in hand, picked up where David left off. But they too dissolved into tears before they could finish, and trailed back to their pews, with David unashamedly wailing, as was nearly everyone else in the church. After the service, they once more carried Paul's coffin out to the hearse and got in, riding together beside the casket, to Lincoln Memorial Park Cemetery in Clinton Township, Michigan. At the gravesite, the casket was opened again, whereupon Eddie kneeled down and kissed Paul's face, his personal adieu to the childhood friend who had talked him into leaving Birmingham, swearing that they'd both be rich and famous one day. How long ago that seemed now. The postscript of Paul's valediction was, as Paul had painfully learned, that being rich and famous offered little security. At the wake the day before, when David, Eddie, and Cornelius had gotten out of their car and were walking to the church, they were mugged by 3 thugs who targeted them because of their expensive suits. They were knocked down, and David's leather bag was ripped from his shoulder and his jewelry from his fingers and wrist, though one of the muggers, not impressed with all of the ice, threw some back, sneering, "Here, you can keep this." When the rites of mourning were over, Eddie gave an interview to the Detroit Free Press. While he managed to hold his tongue about who he considered the villain in Paul's demise, Berry Gordy, he implicitly admonished those who had gone on with their lives, while Paul, as he said, sat around on corners waiting for something to happen in his life, and that Paul being kept on the payroll was only good enough to make him feel bad every time he looked up on the wall and saw all that gold. He recalled how a week or so before, when he saw him, for what would be the last time, Paul grabbed his arm and told him, "Remember, man, you're only as good as your last show." David did not go public with his grievances, but engulfed as he was by cocaine-fed paranoia about Motown, he was convinced that they, as he put it, without needing to elaborate, had killed Paul, and not merely in the metaphorical sense. According to Jenna Sapia, he felt that Motown killed Paul as an example of what could happen to him and Eddie if they didn't toe the line. Why this would have been the case made sense only in his muddled mind, but had to do with the fact that he and Eddie were making lots of waves. At that point, David certainly would have wanted Eddie to pose as an equal victim of Motown vengeance, but that was hardly possible once trucking soared to #1 on the pop and R&B charts in the fall and had been anointed by many as the prime mover of the disco wave. That song used to drive me nuts. I was about 7 years old, guys, and I used to dance my butt off to keep on trucking because it made you want to dance. Eddie would score nearly as big with the follow-up, Boogie Down, Baby, which went to #2 pop and #1 R&B in early 1974. But tougher as it was for David to get into Eddie's mind, given his solo success, and now that he was a continent away living in LA, he would warn him not to let his head get too inflated. "Them people will never leave you to F alone," Ruffin gopher Tony Turner quoted Ruffin telling Kendricks, again omitting the pertinent fact that he had chosen to stay at Motown. "They'll find a way to get you. They'll fire you and hold you to your contract. And if your contract says you got to do 2 albums a year, they'll take you to the studio and record you 2 times a year and then not release the albums." If such pettiness seemed inconceivable to Eddie in 1974, for David it sounded very familiar. After all, who had been more anointed than David Ruffin was in 1968? And just look where he was now. Exasperated by a lack of creative and financial control, Kendricks left Motown in 1978. He moved first to Arista Records and later to Atlantic Records. By this time, his popularity had waned, and he was also gradually losing his upper range as a result of chain smoking. Kendricks and Ruffin rejoined the Temptations for a well-received 1982 reunion tour. The group, then a 7-piece act, also recorded a reunion album and enjoyed a hit with the Rick James written and produced Standing on the Top. Kendricks sang a few lead lines on the song, but had no leads on any of the LP's other tracks. In an interview with Tom Meros, Dennis Edwards, Kendrick's former Temptations bandmate claimed that Kendricks had issues hitting the higher notes during recording sessions for the album. Because of his singing difficulty, Edwards said that Kendricks went to a physician to examine his vocal ability. The physician discovered a pin drop of cancer on one of his lungs. However, Kendricks reportedly refused to undergo chemotherapy at the time because of fear that he would lose his hair. Ruffin and Kendricks reportedly met up one night when Ruffin went to watch Kendrick perform in a nightclub. Kendrick spotted Ruffin in the crowd, pointed him out, and invited him to come up on stage and perform with him. Afterward, they talked about touring on their own and recorded an album as a duo for RCA in 1988. Earlier in 1985, they participated in the Hall & Oates live album Live at the Apollo, recorded at a benefit at New York City's Apollo Theater, and sang with the duo at Live Aid in Philadelphia and the MTV Video Music Awards in New York. Hall & Oates have cited Kendrick and Ruffin specifically, and the Temptations in general, as a major influence. Ruffin started touring with Kendricks as a duo act in 1985. The live medley of The Way You Do the Things You Do and My Girl was released as a single, reaching number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100, number 12 on the Adult Contemporary chart, and number 40 on the R&B chart. The single earned them a Grammy nomination. In 1989, Kendrick, Ruffin, and their Temptations bandmates were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. There, Kendricks and Ruffin made plans with former Temptation Dennis Edwards to tour and record as Ruffin Kendricks Edwards, former leads of the Temptations. The Ruffin Kendrick Edwards project was cut short in 1991 when Kendrick was diagnosed with lung cancer and David Ruffin died of a drug overdose. Although Kendrick and Edwards continued to tour for the remainder of 1991, after having surgery in late 1991, Kendricks resumed touring through the summer of 1992. In late 1991, Kendricks, by now living in his native Birmingham, Alabama, underwent surgery to have one of his lungs removed in hopes of preventing the spread of cancer. He believed the disease was caused by his 30 years of smoking. He continued to tour through the summer of 1992 when he fell ill again and was hospitalized. Kendricks died of lung cancer at Baptist Medical Center Princeton in Birmingham on October 5, 1992 at age 52. He was survived by his 3 children, Paris, Aika, and Paul Kendricks, named after Paul Williams. Funeral services were held at the First Baptist Church in Ensley, Alabama. He was buried in Elmwood Cemetery, Birmingham, Jefferson County, Alabama. Friends and fans paid tribute to Kendricks during 4 concerts held at the Strand in Los Angeles on October 16 and October 17, 1992. Performers included Bobby Womack, Chaka Khan, Mary Wilson, and Vesta Williams, who sang Temptation songs as well as some of their own. Rest in peace to the late Eddie Kendricks. He will always be a legend. And I'm in my era, and the era before me, and the era before me, and he's still a legend now. I know that Eddie was definitely a huge part of the soundtrack to my life. Peace and love.